The Mediterranean. The cradle of European civilization. The birthplace of archaeology on land and archaeology underwater. Today, the Mediterranean attracts millions of tourists, many of them divers, some of them looters, because there is more to discover here, underwater, than anywhere in the world. The Mediterranean has always been the world's busiest seaway. There are literally thousands of shipwrecks, from modern rusting hulks to vessels from antiquity. And each shipwreck is a time capsule. For the looter, it provides souvenirs. For the archaeologist, it provides new information about cargoes and how ships were built. Each year, underwater expeditions, like that from the University of Oxford, are locating new sites, filling in the blank pages of man's early maritime history. The project's leader, who believes he has made a major new discovery, is archaeologist Menson Bound.
And here we are on Panarea, that right there behind me, and what do we have? We have a wreck from the absolute height of the classical period. It's wonderful.
Right, diver? Okay.
For 100 years, from the mid-19th century, the deep-sea diver had to wear a cumbersome metal helmet and diving suit, with an equally cumbersome land-based air supply. It was using this equipment that ancient shipwrecks were first discovered.
These are Turkish sponge divers. For years, this one crew has been familiar with over 30 ancient shipwrecks. But now, this familiarity is shared with a new kind of diver.
This new kind of diver was the diver freed from the constraints of the heavy metal helmet, who carried his own air supply, the aqualung, on his back. It meant he could swim almost anywhere. He was no longer tethered to the surface.
Here you go. Just stand there a minute. Have a bit of a rinse. You all right? Just try going under. Stop it misting.
The sea was open to anyone, and diving is now big business. Even big fashion business.
So first off, the latest suits are at the front.
Diving is one of the fastest growing sports in the world, and one of the more expensive. The sport diver has to spend over £500 just on basic equipment before taking the plunge.
Yes, I can feel it, but it's in the back.
But it's the excitement and adventure of being underwater that can lead to souvenir hunting. Wrecks are being systematically picked clean.
About 5 years. 5, 6 years. How strong is your club? I think it's about 130.
Pretty objects for the mantelpiece.
It's quite a big club in terms of quite a strong wrecking branch.
But divers are now beginning to want to know more about the wrecks themselves.
The introductory course usually takes place over a weekend of lectures, practical surveying tasks in air, followed by them in the pool. And then we follow that up with a part 2, which is field archaeology underwater. and that takes place on actual protected wreck sites.
The Mediterranean, 1950.
This is Captain Kamalo Ross. He dives for sponges. Going across the seabed with his leaden feet, he pays little attention to what relics of history may be lying about, unless he sees something he could use on his own boat, as a water jar perhaps. But it was divers like him who brought up the famous statues along the coast of North Africa and Greece, which are now in the museums of those countries. Men like Captain Ross could be considered the first true underwater archaeologists.
Archaeologists perhaps, but the first real professionals were from land-based excavations, trained to dive.
Are you going to come down with me? I don't want to be like these aging opera singers that can't hit the high notes anymore. I've been doing it for a quarter of a century. I think it's better just to stop at some point.
One of the first was an American, George Bass.
I think that underwater archaeology is developed in 5 stages, the first being the chance finds of fishermen and sponge divers going back to the 19th century, even the 18th century, with statues and pottery coming up out of the sea in nets. It wasn't until the invention of the aqualung by Cousteau and Gagnon in the 40s in France that divers had the necessary mobility, however, for doing actual excavation, delicate work in fragile ships' hulls. And the second stage were the pioneering efforts of people like Cousteau that led the way then to the third stage, which is when the archaeologists themselves began to dive and do the work, and it became proper archaeology.
It was in the early 1960s that George Bass took archaeology underwater.
An ancient wreck looks nothing like the wrecks which I grew up seeing pictures of in books. There's no captain tied to the tiller, there's no rigging. What you usually see is just a flat, barren seabed with a few objects that are non-perishable sticking up through the sand.
The castle at Bodrum in Turkey became the center of his operations.
I just happened to be the right person at the right time. I was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania when Peter Throckmorton found what at that time was the oldest shipwreck in the world, the Bronze Age shipwreck at Cape Caledonia, Turkey. I was asked if I would learn how to dive to be the archaeological director of a project. The next wreck we did in the early 1960s, 1961 to 1964, was a 7th century Byzantine ship which did have hull remains, and we were learning how to map them, but not to conserve them. And the hull remains were not terribly well preserved, but well enough preserved that we could reconstruct the ship on paper and make models of it.
Archaeologists brought their science to underwater excavation. The site itself was recorded. Grids laid for reference, and everything photographed, as in a land site, but with 100 feet of water lying on top. The principal tool of the underwater archaeologist is the airlift. It gently removes the sand and sediments covering the site. And it was the airlift that provided the first clue to the age of Bass's wreck. In the spoil from the airlift, in among the sand, shells and coral, was a gold coin. It proved the wreck to date from about 700 AD. Not all underwater techniques were entirely orthodox. Eating grapes for lunch, for example. Communication with the surface was primitive. Other techniques were positively dangerous. Amphora, the great historic Mediterranean storage jars, were raised to the surface by being manually filled with air. Apart from the danger to the diver of removing his mouthpiece, the jars would sometimes crack under the pressure, and pieces of broken pottery and contents would rain down on the archaeologists. They would learn from their mistakes. Better methods of raising artifacts included wicker shopping baskets, ideal for the purpose. And the objects themselves were in a remarkable condition. Far from the sea destroying them, they had been preserved. And the young George Bass was keen to discover more.
We know already that ships carried obsidian from the island of Milos to the Greek mainland 9,000 years ago in the pre-pottery period, Neolithic period. And we can assume, I think, that probably every year of every century of every millennium since that time, a ship has gone down in a storm or on a reef or on fire, and they're lying there waiting to be found.
We knew little of what ancient ships actually looked like until recently, and this information came only from paintings in tombs and on pottery. But a shipwreck found off Cyprus at Kyrenia in 1965 was to change all that. A ship laden with amphora. Beneath the amphora were shapeless lumps that turned out to be spearheads when examined by Michael Katsev.
Why she sank was a problem for us to come to a conclusion for some time. There's no natural hazards, no reefs near where she sank off Kyrenia. We thought perhaps a storm had suddenly blown up and she was sent to the bottom in a natural catastrophe. And because of the negative evidence, the lack of finds, we found no gold or silver coinage, which is so important in a merchant adventure. We found hardly any personal possessions, just a few little bone eyelets from a sandal. And with them, the positive evidence of these iron spears, we've concluded that the ship was sunk by pirates. The crew taken in captivity. For them, of course, a tragedy. They were probably subsequently sold as slaves. But for us, a great fortune that the ship did sink there off Kyrenia, and because of the conditions was so well preserved.
Although it was over 2,000 years old and had the strength of wet cardboard, it gave Katsev the audacious idea of raising the entire ship. With improved photographic techniques, the exact position of every timber could be plotted on the seabed. Only when this was completed could each piece of wood be gently lifted to the surface. Immersed in a solution of soluble wax, the wood, over a period of 2 years, regained its strength. Each section of wood was now ready for Katsev's team to piece back together. All this to discover for the first time how a 2,000-year-old boat was constructed. Piece by piece, month by month, the ship began to take shape. In 1973, the last piece of the oldest seagoing vessel yet recovered was finally inserted. A remarkable 70% of the ship's hull had survived. Not satisfied with this, Katsev himself built a new ship to confirm just how the ancient Greeks had built their hulls. Ancient shipwrights, it showed, built their hull first, using mortise and tenon joints with pegs holding each plank together. Each plank was individually crafted out of a log of wood, a long, wasteful, and labor-intensive technique. Then the frames of the vessel were placed inside the already formed shell to provide strength.
Yes.
But the modern method of wooden-hulled shipbuilding, still employed in Greece today, uses a frame-first technique. The frame of the ship, like a giant fishbone, is the first section built. It's only after the frame is constructed that the planks are bent into shape and hammered into place. The whole process requires less labor and less wood, and the completed vessel has more strength and is more seaworthy than the older mortise and tenon boats. Bass's excavation in 1977 at Sirce Liman in Turkey, which also raised a hull, was to provide the clue to when this type of ship construction was first used.
Because this hull proved to be the earliest example we have of a modern seagoing hull. So for the history of seafaring, it's a very important document, these 5,000 fragments of wood being put together.
The date? About 1050 AD, the time of the Norman conquest. But it was the cargo of the ship that was to raise another question for George Bass. Shapeless lumps brought up from the seabed proved to be glass. The contents of the wreck were taken back to Bodrum Castle.
Isn't that nice?
Yeah, that's terrific.
It's a good one.
When we began this job, we had no idea that we'd find any joins. We were faced with an enormous archaeological problem. On the 11th century ship at Sirce Liman, we had several tons of glass. We had 80 intact pieces of glass, but these came from the ends of the ship, which were probably living quarters, so these belonged to the crew or they were items of merchandise. But in the center of the ship as cargo, we had several tons of broken glass, over 1 million pieces perhaps, including several tons of raw glass cullet, that is, chunks of glass that had been melted down but was going to be remelted and then blown into vessels at some later date. We didn't know the nature of this broken glass at first, but eventually we determined that this was all glass that had been swept up from floors, perhaps from glass factories, put into baskets and bags, put on board the ship, and then just as in the modern day we recycle glass, and I've seen graduate student volunteers tamping it down like this to take up less space, some sailor seems to have, and it breaks our hearts, seems to have simply broken it all down into smaller pieces so it would take the least space possible, which of course makes our job harder.
So the Sirce Liman ship was perhaps an early seagoing dust cart, but also found were entire pieces of rare and beautiful glass, perhaps saved by these dustmen, examples of a sophisticated culture 1,000 years old. Sophisticated and cultivated today is the island of Panarea, off Sicily, a favorite haunt for holidaying Italian millionaires. It is also the headquarters, in much less luxurious surroundings, of the Oxford University expedition. Although the leader, Menson Bound, is himself a professional archaeologist, most of his team are sport divers.
I suppose the average age of the people on the team would be somewhere between 35 and, let's say, 40. They're all sort of professionals in one skill or another. They're people in employment. They have a couple of weeks off each year. They don't really want to spend that time on the beach. They want challenge and purpose in their life. They've been diving for, let's say, 10, 12 years. They're fed up looking at fishes. They want something else out of their diving. When you look at them, a journalist a couple of years once called them the dogs of archaeology. And I mean, you look at them, they do look like rather haphazard assemblage of pretty rough characters.
Rough or not, they all give up their free time and pay their own way as voluntary archaeologists.
Who wants to be a millionaire?
I don't.
Who wants uranium to spare?
I don't.
Who wants to journey on a gigantic yacht?
Do I want a yacht? Oh, how I do not. Who wants a fancy foreign car?
I don't.
Who wants to tire of caviar?
I don't. Who wants a marble swimming pool too?
I don't.
And I don't, 'cause all I want is you.
The site of the university expedition lies a mile offshore. It was found in 1984 by a local diver, Alessandro Tilce. Although not an archaeologist, he recognized pieces of pottery on the seabed. Menson Bound believes that this pottery is Athenian fineware of the 5th century BC, and that it comes from a wreck of the same date. If he's right, and if he can find evidence of the wreck, it will be the first time that a boat from the height of the Greek classical period has been uncovered. But the search will not be easy.
The site is unusual because it's in a volcanically active area. This whole complex of islands here falls on the let's say the volcanic fault line, if you like, between Mount Etna to the south in Sicily and Vesuvius in the Bay of Naples. I've never seen anything quite like it. I mean, there are times when the bubbles just come gushing up from this site. And of course, as they dissolve, they are forming a dilute acid in the water. So that as you're actually working down there, very often you feel a sort of a faint, I don't know, tingling sensation around the lips like that. And it was a geologist who explained to us what was happening. We're actually getting burnt by the acid as we work. But it does kill off a lot of the fish life in the area, so that when you're down there, it is rather bizarre, something rather primeval about this site, which is a little intimidating at first.
Bound's team consists of some 20 divers. From the anchored support boat, they dive on site twice a day.
Okay, 10 seconds. Mark. 5. Down.
We began last year by surveying the wreck, trying to define the limits of the spread. Then we came back this year to begin excavation, first laying the grids and then removing the other burden of sand. We had hoped that the main concentration of the wreck would be in that sandy area, but now I got to say it looks like we're still on the periphery of the main wreck area. It's a problem. We've been working for 2 weeks and we're still not getting the critical information we'd hoped for.
When the site was first discovered, artifacts were lying on the surface of the sand, giving a clue to the ship's whereabouts. Now, these clues have gone. Archaeological sites are always at risk from looters. bound has to dig deeper for any further clues. Like this cup. Because the site is at a depth of over 100 feet, excavation is long and laborious. Divers can only work safely on the bottom for 20 minutes at a time. And as they swim to the surface, they must pause for a decompression stop to allow the excess nitrogen in their blood to dissolve.
They're coming up to 5 now. Yeah. They're both okay.
Okay, both take up good clear signal, okay?
Yeah, 2 clear okay signals. No problem.
Decompression can take up to 5 minutes. If a diver doesn't decompress properly, he runs the risk of the bends, which can mean paralysis or even death.
Okay, divers coming up. 1, Joanna. Stands up 2. Pass me that.
Yep, got it.
Can I have your hour, please, Joe?
Yep, it's 110.
110. And your hour, please, Stan? 100. 100, thank you.
Anything in this?
Yep, open it up.
Okay.
Be very, very careful, it's extremely delicate. And there's 2 together.
2 what?
2 skiffle.
Wow. It's incredible. Unbelievable. Yeah, 2 cups, one within the other.
Yeah.
Obviously they're packed like this. Let me just put this down. Don't seem packed
Careful,
like this.
I don't know if it's actually stuck or what.
We're missing it. No, yeah, let's not take it apart, okay? Because it may be packing between these 2 cups. You get the coordinates and things.
Yeah, we got the measurements.
Okay, let's get this back to Lizzie.
Back at the excavation's headquarters, the cups are catalogued, photographed, and carefully drawn.
All the artifacts that were raised so far from this wreck have been fine wares. And by that I mean things like cups, plates, dishes, lamps, things of that nature. All from Athens, and all high-quality, lustrous, black glaze, which is characteristic of Athens at this period. Usually wrecks from antiquity, of course, are characterized by large amphora spreads. So far, we've only seen the bottom half of one amphora. That's very unusual indeed. Let's go through this morning's diving in the order of the dives. The first pair in were
Chris and Ali.
Chris and Ali. Chris, why don't you go?
Yes, Alistair and myself went down shot line into grid 8. Set up a day glow corridor of 1 metre wide and started the airlift. Couldn't find anything, no finds at all. And then Stan and Mike came down and took over from us.
So we just continued doing what they'd done, made fair amount of progress there. Unfortunately, there was no finds, no body fragments or anything to be seen. And then Rico just took over from us when we finished.
Again, it looked like that grid square is largely barren.
It looks that way, yeah.
It's not quite what we expected, but there's a lot which is puzzling about this wreck. We've been here now, we've just completed our 2nd season on this site, but it still isn't really coming together in my mind. It's a site which is resisting. In underwater archaeology, when you start on a new site, it's a bit like chess. There's an opening series of gametes that you can use, and we have been employing these gametes, but they haven't been responding. It hasn't been getting us back so far the information we need that tells us about the wreck, its nationality, the route it was pursuing, things like that, and how these things in turn can help illuminate the classical period. Okay, well, in that case, gentlemen, your terms of reference for this afternoon. Simple. Back to grid 8, carry on excavating. So I'm a wee bit frustrated, but in that regard, but it will come. I mean, wrecks don't just suddenly discharge their opulence or their information, if you like, because you want them to. I mean, it has to be sort of painstakingly coaxed out of them. And I think that's what's going to be here. It's going to take a lot of time, but it will come together. We will get these answers.
The few answers that he has had are not what he expected or wanted. Recent finds suggest a wreck not from the 5th century BC, but a century later. But in Bodrum, Turkey, George Bass is having more success. In the castle, the Turkish authorities have set up a museum of diving. It contains many of Bass's discoveries. In the mid-1970s, Bass formed the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, and since 1984, he's been excavating a site that dates back to the time of the Bronze Age, nearly 3,500 years ago. His team comprises archaeologists trained to dive and technicians, American, British, and Turkish. Their camp is perched on forbidding cliffs along the coast from Bodrum at Kosh, and for 6 weeks of the year, it's home. Below these cliffs, in over 150 feet of water, lie the remains of the Bronze Age shipwreck that could be the oldest known shipwreck in the world.
Well, every year we have a survey.
Bass's right-hand man is Don Fry.
And we rely mostly on Turkish sponge divers. I know most people think that because I'm a physicist, we have some sort of exotic remote sensing devices like side scan sonar or magnetometers. But you know, there are about 100 sponge divers who go out every year. 5 or 6 of them to a boat. And they dive for 100 days, so that's 10,000 man days, and it's an hour a day, 10,000 man hours on the bottom. So that's a tremendous amount of remote sensing time. So when we talk to the sponge divers about the things they saw on the seabed, the conversation was almost always about the amphoras, the large storage jars that were characteristic of the cargo of the wrecks. But I would always come along and say, well, now, in addition to this, you know, sometimes the cargo was made of things like this, and I would draw the picture of a Bronze Age ingot and ask these people whether they'd seen one or if they ever saw one to please be sure to tell us. As a matter of fact, that's how we really got the Bronze Age shipwreck report, because the captain was told this by one of his crewmen, and he said, well, this is what the archaeologists in Bodrum were looking for.
Because of the depth of the site, safety is paramount. This telephone booth provides both refuge for the diver and communication with the surface.
This morning then, the first dive will be Jack and Oshkin. They're going to do a 20-minute dive and try to get the rest of the telephone booth put together. We're working in the upper part of the wreck, and we're finding out it's just thick with amphoras and ingots and so forth. And so I want you just to hand fan down the slope, and those of you who are new at hand fanning, this doesn't do any good at all. It has to be a sweeping motion with your hand in one direction, where you raise your hand out of the dust each time and then clear it off with your arm in big swoops like that. Now, don't worry about being overly rough when you're on tops of amphoras, because you'll never find a small object like a weight or a cylinder seal or a scarab up high in the sand. They sink down. The smallest object could be very valuable. A scarab could date the wreck for us. So when you airlift, be careful that you don't let anything go up into the airlift except for sand and sediment. Now remember that each of you is responsible for your own area. Take detailed notes and remember about narcosis. At that depth you're going to be confused, so plan your dive in advance. Rehearse it with your partner if you need to. You've only got 20 minutes on the wreck twice a day. You can't afford to waste time. I do want to stress we're working beyond the limits of air diving. We're starting at 140 feet and going down to 170 feet. So watch your partner going up and down the shot line especially. That's the most critical point. If you're down in the bottom, go in the phone booth if you have a problem. If you're up the top, of course, you can reach the decompression stop mouthpieces. But in between, you've got a long way where there's no air.
It's 20 minutes on the bottom, 2 minutes at 20 feet and 7 minutes on the 10-foot stop.
22 and 7, okay.
Ready? And go.
We're not really that involved in technology anymore. We're using rather crude techniques in a way. On the Shipwreck, we've gone back to measuring with meter tapes, which we hadn't done in 27 years. It's effective. The reason it's effective is that the divers who are doing this understand precisely what they're seeing on the seabed. They understand every little piece of wood because they've been trained in ship construction and the like before they dive.
More and more artifacts begin to appear, both familiar and rare. It doesn't take an archaeologist to recognize a gold cup.
This is Don, over.
Oh, hi, Don. Can you tell George to get over there? Over to the boat, quick. I got something really interesting.
What do you have, Robin?
I've never ever seen gold like that underwater.
You joke?
It's a large cup, I'm sure of it.
This is no tramp steamer.
I tell you, the insurance brokers took a pounding.
But gold will bring the looters.
If it gets out there's gold on this wreck, it's going to get exaggerated, and people will say it's a wreck full of gold. You know, we have no way of putting a guard here in the winter, so I would like to keep it a secret as long as possible. Now it's going to get out.
For the archaeologist searching for information, gold is not necessarily the most valuable cargo. An unusual or unexpected find can revise theories.
Nobody knew there were ingots of glass this early. I said 25 years ago, the reason we couldn't identify Canaanite traders is because they were trading raw materials. But I didn't expect to find raw glass.
Or this large jar called a pithos, covered with concretions and looking like just another rock.
And this is obviously deposited after the ingots. This is just bedrock. I would also like to get the big pithos out as soon as possible. Now, I'd like to get it up where we can actually start taking samples of the pollen and sediment inside. I would have thought this large jar, this pithos, was for water. They're shown on the decks of Canaanite ships and Egyptian tomb paintings, but we had no idea that they were cargo containers.
They're all pouring out the big pithos.
What?
Yes.
The pithos is full of chlorine?
Yes, 4 of them already, and they're pouring out. Pithos içinden dökülüyor.
Oh, wow.
Well, I can say that this ship was definitely coming from Cyprus.
Oh, look at that.
Be very careful. Wait, very, very careful. Okay.
Oh my God. Look at that. We got some buckets ready. Wow.
And they just, well, look at that stuff. Look at that stuff. They didn't come out of a tomb better than that. You know, if we found one piece of pottery that well preserved on the Cape Elizabeth, how excited we'd have been.
Yeah.
One piece that well preserved. They're just coming up out of a bucket now.
Yes, George, let's go.
Let's go. Let's go dive.
But Bass's early theories of the ship being Canaanite were contradicted by further pottery finds, some from Cyprus, but others from Agamemnon's Mycenae. all of them fabulously well preserved.
I've seen it on the seabed, so I know, but I haven't seen it up close.
The goblet, yeah.
What do you make of this? It's coming clear as
The
it dries.
decoration?
It's
a typical foliate band, and I think it has the ivy leaf pattern.
Okay.
See and here's the dot. See the dot up at the top of the ivy leaf?
Yeah. And that's what?
With the wavy band.
Yeah.
The only problem is that this is red paint rather than the glossy seal black paint that was typically Mycenaean. But it looks like a local imitation because it doesn't have the same
It's 14th
standard
century,
of,
though.
It is 14th century.
That's what matters. That's what matters. This is the last thing. This is the Pilgrim flask. And this is 14th century because it's like the one found on the survey.
Yes.
Proof, perhaps, that this ship sank in 1400 BC, nearly 3,500 years ago, and is the oldest known shipwreck in the world. But was this a royal ship or a merchant ship? These copper ingots, the gold cup, the bronze and the silver, may provide the evidence.
I think archaeologists misunderstood by most people. They think we're just interested in the objects. Archaeologists are not interested in objects themselves, but what they can learn from them.
Got it?
We really don't know how trade in the Bronze Age worked. We don't know if shipments of the type we're excavating right now were sold for profit or whether they were simply royal exchanges between kings and pharaohs.
"25 years ago, these amphora would simply have been filled with air, floated to the surface, and their contents lost. Now, the necks are sealed underwater, and the jars carefully placed in baskets. Science has moved on. Scientific techniques are now so sophisticated that the contents of the amphora can be analyzed. Kernels of wheat, olive stones, spices, myrrh, frankincense.
Okay, I think that will do it.
Products of many countries round the eastern Mediterranean, pointing to a level of trade never before imagined.
Except for the copper, most of the cargo could have come from the Syro-Palestinian coast, even though it had to arrive there from overseas or overland, like the tin probably came from Afghanistan. The myrrh and the frankincense we know have to have come from South Arabia or Somalia and Africa all the way up, but we know from ancient texts they were both shipped out of this area. Now, the ivory is okay right here. We had elephants and hippopotamuses in this part of the world still at that time. And Bob Brill has analyzed the glass ingots, and the glass is chemically identical both to Mycenaean Greek glass and to Egyptian glass of that period. So that means both places were importing it from wherever our glass ingot was made. Then wherever it was loaded on, the ship sailed across to Cyprus and picked up its load of copper, and then from there it went on to Kosh, where it sank. But I'm not sure on its way where. I have no idea at this time.
Well, how about Kosh itself? And then to Rhodes, even perhaps to Mycenae in Greece, Komos in Crete, and complete the circuit down the north of Africa, Egypt, up to the Syro-Palestinian coast again.
So maybe they were just stopping, unloading a little bit, putting on some more, and we'll never know the destination because there was none. It was just continuously going around in a circle. At what point do you say you're not going to dive anymore? and then stick to it.
You can set it any time you want to, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to dive at all. I mean, you might not want to work on a regular basis or something, you know, diving. We have to keep on exchanging ideas about excavation back and forth. You can't certainly close a book and say that's it.
This afternoon. Afternoon dive with you.
Right, okay.
All right.
Fine, but you got to do a dive now.
Okay. I think I remember how. I think. When we started this excavation, I really wanted this to turn out to be a Canaanite ship. I wanted to prove certain theories, but it's just so much richer than I'd ever dreamed possible that the nationality is no longer important because it's raised new questions for us to answer. It's just so much more important than that one theory. It's opening new doors to the past. It's going to take us on a voyage of its own.
In just 25 years of underwater archaeology in the Mediterranean, the archaeologists are beginning to understand how the ancient Greeks and Romans built their ships. The discovery of thousands of amphora, the analysis of their different shapes, size and content, has revealed their age, their place of origin, and the lifestyles of the people at the time when the vessels sank. Although much has been lost to looters, these precious artifacts that could never have survived on a land site have been preserved by the sea.